Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Ruby Rogues podcast. This week on our panel, we have Dave Kimura.
Hey, everyone.
John Epperson.
Hello, everybody.
Luke Stutters.
Hello.
I'm Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs. And this week, we're talking to Andy Maleh. Andy, do you want to introduce yourself? Let people know who you are and why you're famous?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm famous yet, but my name is Andy Maleh, and I've been a Ruby developer since about 2006. I've done software engineering for about 18, 19 years, and I built Glimmer in Ruby, which is a desktop development library. It's an open source project.
Gotcha. Hey, folks, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and lately I've been working on actually building out Top End Devs. If you're interested, you can go to topenddevs.com/podcast, and you can actually hear a little bit more about my story, about why I'm doing what I'm doing with Top End Devs, why I changed it from devchat.tv to Top End Devs. But what I really want to get into is that I have decided that I'm going to build the platform that I always wished I had with devchat.tv, and I renamed it to Top End Devs because I want to give you the resources that are going to help you to build the career that you want, right? So whether you want to be an influencer in tech, whether you want to go and just max out your salary and then go live a lifestyle with your family, your friends, or just traveling the world or whatever, I want to give you the resources that are going to help you do that. We're going to have career and leadership resources in there, and we're going to be giving you content on a regular basis to help you level up and max out your career. So go check it out at topenddevs.com. If you sign up before my birthday, that's December 14th. If you sign up before my birthday, you can get 50% off the lifetime of your subscription. Once again, that's topenddevs.com. So do you want to just kind of give us the 10,000 foot view on what Glimmer is?
Yeah, sure. So Glimmer is a desktop development library that basically leverages all the full potential of Ruby in order to provide a very productive and good experience of developing desktop applications in Ruby. So some of the examples of things that Glimmer helps with is giving you conventions in order to work more in the same style of Rails development, like convention over configuration, as well as giving you a domain-specific language, a DSL, to build GUI in a declarative fashion so that you write a lot less code, maybe 1/4 of the code or even less that you would write building desktop apps without Glimmer, or even in other languages like, say, Java or C++. One last thing is Glimmer provides data binding support as well, bidirectional data binding. I believe it's the only Ruby desktop development library that provides that feature, which greatly improves productivity in synchronizing view data with model attributes.
Cool. I want to get the story behind this, but I tend to like to kind of go with, what have you seen people do with it, right? What is it capable of?
So, I mean, there are a number of apps built with it some are closed source and some are open source. As far as closed source, the biggest app I've seen was somebody visited a company that I was working at in Chicago a while back, who showed me a medical app, a full-fledged medical app built with Glimmer. That was a desktop application, and that was pretty rewarding to see. But other than that, I know there are a few people that are building some closed source apps, and I built a number of open source apps in it, like games like Wordle or Tetris, things like a small desktop project management app that an interior designer is using right now at an architecture business, and even a small IDE called Gladiator. It's open source.
So, so why'd you build it? Because it seems like there have been other systems out there for this kind of thing.
So my background at the time when I came up with Glimmer was I was a Java desktop developer. I was building apps I built apps using Swing, Java Swing, as well as Java SWT. I liked SWT because it enabled me to build apps in Java with all the productivity of Java that looked just like apps built with C++, with full native widgets on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Mm-hmm. However, I discovered Rails in around 2006, and I was fascinated by how productive it was. I mean, you write at least a quarter of the code that you would write in Java to do the same thing, and I could deliver much faster in Rails. So I wanted to bring the same productivity benefits to desktop development in Ruby. And the libraries at the time, like GTK, TK, and WX Ruby, were not very, they worked, but they did not have APIs that were declarative. They were more kind of like writing Java code, but writing it in Ruby. So they did not really improve that much over building desktop apps in Java. So I wanted to push Ruby to its limit to try to build a desktop framework. And the only thing I found was Shoes at the time that was trying to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But Shoes had reliability issues that would crash randomly. And also it was not supporting some of the most important business widgets like table and tree. So that was a very big problem that made it a non-starter for building desktop business apps. Shoes also had a look and feel that was a bit like the web, which is a bit inappropriate for small desktop apps. The whole point of desktop apps is you just use simple widgets and you're able to deploy and deliver apps very quickly on the desktop without having to worry too much about styling. So these are all the reasons why I ended up building Glimmer. Oh yeah, one last thing is data binding. I wanted to have data binding support, which I had in Java using the SWT JFace data binding library. So I wanted to have the same thing in Ruby. And I was able to make it even better than whatever I had in Java. Like in Java, if I wanted to data bind a table, it would take me a page of code. In Ruby, it was like a single line of code.
Very cool. I think somebody else was trying to chime in when I asked my last question. So
earlier, I was just kind of wanting to ask, so what kind of, from like a performance perspective, so one of the things that I noticed a lot about like Electron apps is they have like a little bit of a laggy feel to them. Does this feel like pretty native?
No, this is quick.
Without that kind of like input lag and stuff?
No, it's. I've got to say, I fired it up. This is basically as fast as a totally native desktop app. It really is very slick.
Yeah, like to answer your question with an example, like if you build an app using the Glimmer DSL for SWT library, it basically uses JRuby, and JRuby will end up calling out to the SWT library. And the SWT library is actually architected in a way where the Java code will call out to C or C++ code behind the scenes. So what I'm trying to say is the app, although it's written in Ruby or JRuby, the GUI part of the app will execute immediately in C++ because it's wrapped by Java, which is wrapped by JRuby. And the GUI part will execute always immediately. The Ruby code might have, Ruby performance characteristics, but with desktop apps, it's so simple, usually the logic app of desktop apps, that it runs very fast. There's no delay usually.
Awesome.
It is quick, but I'd like to get into what Glimmer is, because it's not just a way of writing a desktop GUI app. It's almost kind of like a framework on top of various different backends to write a GUI app. Is that right?
Yes, Glimmer started out as one library for one GUI toolkit, which was SWT. But eventually, I had this idea of why not bring the same benefit to other GUI toolkits. And one example is libui. Libui is a C library for building GUIs. And I figured, JRuby has a bit of a slow startup time. It's like 3 seconds maybe on the latest ARM64 processors. However, C Ruby starts immediately. So if I can wrap something similar to SWT with the same Glimmer DSL technology, I get the same benefits, but in C Ruby. And that's why I ended up extracting Glimmer as its own DSL framework that can be used to build any Glimmer DSL. And then I built Glimmer DSL for libui in it, as well as Glimmer DSL for Opal, for example, which lets you use the same syntax, but build web GUI with JavaScript using Opal Ruby.
So the Opal is a bit of a kind of mind-bending thing, right? Because what that's doing is using the declarative GUI builder in Glimmer to build a website.
Yes, to build the front end of a website. Yes, exactly.
I haven't got into that, but what inspired you to do that? Because that is like a pretty crazy thing to do.
Well, I mean, in my opinion, any Rubyist who's a true Rubyist should be excited about Opal because it lets us write Ruby code on the front end, which, JavaScript has always been hated as one of the ugliest programming languages. And even with all the new ES incarnations, it's still not as nice as real Ruby. So Opal Ruby gave me this idea of what if I could write a desktop GUI and then take that exact same code and move it to the web and execute it using Opal Ruby. And by switching the backend, it'll automatically get processed into JavaScript. and then displayed on the screen. So I was able to get most of the samples that are in the Glimmer DSL for SWT libraries. I was able to get them working in Opal, including Tetris. So it is an experiment. That project is more of an experiment. I wouldn't say it's a completed project by any sense. And I'm still evaluating the idea because I am a big fan of DHH's recommendations in Rails 7 to actually almost not write any JavaScript at all, like avoid any JavaScript and just rely on the backend. I think for simple apps, that's even better. But for apps that do need very elaborate GUIs, I'm actually right now experimenting with the idea of using a Glimmer DSL instead of all that, complicated JS frameworks. So that's the reason why I came up with that, with Glimmer DSL for Opal.
Yeah, I've been playing around with some of the examples that you have here with the little contact form and the table graphs, and that's really cool. The DSL that you have, it's very Ruby-like. So I think the adaptation of this wouldn't be too steep of a learning curve. What are some of the more complicated UI components that you can do with Glimmer that otherwise people would think, oh, you need to use a real desktop framework or like Xcode or something like that, or Swift UI or something?
So you can build custom widgets in Glimmer DSL for SWT, for example, or even Glimmer DSL for libui. And custom widgets enable you to build any visual concept into your own widget with your own ideas. But the good news is also I can reuse all the available SWT custom widgets in Java inside Glimmer DSL for SWT when running in JRuby. So the biggest example I built with this was this project management app that has a Gantt chart. And a Gantt chart is a very, very complex widget, a very complex visual concept that involves, laying out tasks, connecting them with arrows, and having them automatically readjust when you change the length of every task. And I was able to reuse that in Glimmer DSL for SWT instantly with no problem using JRuby. So the good news is that if there are any available widgets for, say, SWT in Java that are used in the enterprise, you can already use them in Ruby today. So there's no problem there. And then if there is anything that's missing, you can build your own visual concepts into your own custom widgets. So I cannot think of anything that I actually do miss from, say, writing Swift code directly right now.
And this might be a shot down question, but I got to ask, is there any compilation or packaging for Glimmer? So can this be easily distributed to those who maybe don't have the Ruby CLI installed?
Yeah, thankfully with the Glimmer DSL for SWT JRuby version, it comes with support for building native executables, like packaging basically a DMG file on the Mac, or MSI on Windows, or deb or RPM on Linux out of the box. So you actually do have that functionality with Glimmer DSL for SWT. It can package them, and then it includes everything in it, including Java. So people don't have to install a single thing. Like they just have to install the, say, MSI package on Windows or the damage package on the Mac, and it works right away. So this problem has been solved already for a while now in the JRuby version of Glimmer. In libui, the Glimmer DSL for libui, I know that Okra, the Ruby library, provides Windows packaging support. I do not, and I know there are a few options for packaging on Mac, but I have not had a chance to test them yet. However, some good news might be coming from the fact that WASI support got merged into Ruby, which might simplify packaging Ruby applications for various platforms in C Ruby. So I would look forward to that and experimenting with that to get that working with Glimmer eventually.
What is WASI support?
Maybe somebody else could chime in on that. I mean, I'd be happy to talk about it. Maybe somebody else knows about it too, since it's not a Glimmer thing.
I don't know.
It's basically
the WebAssembly stuff.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I know it exists. I'm not an expert at it.
I just know that there's been work in basically having Ruby natively support WASM so that you can package Ruby apps as native binaries for the web with WASM. And I've already seen tests of that, like the Try Ruby webpage on the Ruby website will let you run Ruby code in the browser using either Opal Ruby or using WASM directly. And WASI, I do not remember what the acronym was exactly for, but I know it helps with packaging Ruby inside of a sort of a WASM sandbox on various platforms like Mac, Windows, and Linux. And that's all I know about it. I have not dug further into it because I'm waiting for it to become final first.
I was going to say that this actually gives me a reason to kind of care about WebAssembly again. I just kind of thought that it was ghostware. It's never going to happen.
It's out there now. It's just the support on it isn't. It's not where we would want it to work ideally with some of this stuff, and so it's hard to implement in some ways. And this is all stuff that I'm hearing from people. It's not. I haven't actually done anything with WebAssembly yet. So
The browser
This feels a lot more real, though. Go ahead.
I
Sorry,
used WebAssembly to mine bitcoins for someone else without my knowledge.
yeah, it's in the browsers.
Yeah, but just the development experience isn't quite Ruby-esque
Yeah,
as we would like yet.
it's just, yeah, I don't know. It just has always felt like it's just not ready. It's too hard to access. It's too hard there's not enough documentation around it, like for people to really like know what's up. And yeah, literally everyone that's talking about is like, this is coming. And so there's not a lot of people saying this is here yet. Maybe that's a better way of saying it.
yeah. I know people are writing stuff in it. I know people are having success with it. I do not know. I know that, yeah, there's still some concerns over how you kind of bolt everything together. So
Can I tell the
Cool.
story about my awful Ruby desktop app?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I started off, my first job in Ruby was actually programming Ruby desktop apps through Ruby GTK. And instead of it being a declarative model like Glimmer, you had to manually build up your page and your widgets from scratch. So you make each call to put each button on the screen, right? And then have a load of callbacks to handle users clicking around with predictable results. But fast forward about 8 or 9 years, and I've learned Rails, and we had the customer needed a desktop app. And this desktop app had to run in Windows, and it wasn't anything that could be done by a web app. So I wanted to build this in Ruby, right? And it was a fairly sophisticated little thing just to copy files around, right? So just kind of download the file, put the file somewhere, yeah, as a kind of auto downloader for a website. But so I fired up all of the available ways to do this. And of course, I had to look at shoes. I had to look at GTK, like if compatibility in Windows, and a couple more. And what I ended up with was Okra, which is a way of making an exe that runs Ruby, right? So if you want to run Ruby, if you want to send your Ruby program to someone in Windows, you use this Okra, which stands for one-click Ruby application, and they double-click it. And then after you double-clicked it, it just loaded up a black terminal window, because I couldn't get any kind of GUI to work reliably at all. And so it just had text, like 1980s terminal application. I put some color in it. And then the configuration interface consisted of a JSON file, which was about 1,000 lines of JSON. And whenever they edited it, they always used to make a little mistake in the JSON, and then the whole program would blow up. And they'd just be kind of phoning me up, and I'd be copy pasting the JSON file into like a JSON linter online to find the magic error, because I just couldn't make a Ruby desktop app using the tools that I found. And I had shipped a cross-platform app using Java and initially Swing, later SWT, to get their native file chooser. But I just couldn't make it work, in the time available. So they just got garbage, basically. They just got whatever I could throw together. What I'm really excited about here is the libui. This is the new thing for me, the libui, that hugely simplifies deploying Ruby to the desktop, because you don't need JRuby, and you can just kind of drop in a really thin program that will look like a proper Windows or Mac OS app with minimal overhead. But I understand that it's kind of alpha-ish. Is that right?
libui itself is a mid-alpha, yeah.
What is
The Glimmer DSL for libui is actually complete. It covers the entire API of it, but the libui itself is a mid-alpha. So that's what's declared on the project page, meaning they're still missing a few features before they could declare it complete. Like one of the main
anything?
features that are missing are display of images, for example. Right now, there's very rudimentary support for displaying images. It's a bit slow. It's not well supported yet.
Have you got anything that's running using libui, or is it mostly still SWT?
No, I built a few things with libui. One of them, I was able to rebuild the Tetris sample in libui, and that worked pretty well. I also built the bfunge programming language, like an IDE of it in libui, and that worked as well. That might have been the most sophisticated piece of software that I built with Glimmer DSL for libui, and it was leveraging an engine for processing the bfunge programming language, which was actually written in Ruby. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the language, but it gives you a sort of a grid that lets you enter text like a character into every cell of the grid. And that is kind of like the program. And then you can execute the program. And it's a little bit like the Turing machine and the way it works, and how to process the program, moving from cell to cell in the grid. So anyways, yeah, I built that in Glimmer DSL for libui, and that seems to be working pretty well. I have not built any commercial apps with it yet, but yeah, I built a number of open source apps with it.
So what features doesn't it have? Like what is it missing, or what are you working on adding to it?
Yeah, I'm working hard right now on making Glimmer DSL for libui become exactly as feature rich as Glimmer DSL for SWT. The only missing features now, well, there are 3 missing features. One of them is effortless declarative drag and drop. Like in Glimmer DSL for SWT, I can simply designate any widget as draggable, and then another widget as the drop target, and then you drag and drop and it works. So I'm working on adding that to libui for custom widgets. And the second thing is scaffolding for new apps. Glimmer DSL for SWT, it borrows the idea of scaffolding from Rails so that I can simply scaffold an app with an MVC structure. So I need to add that to Glimmer DSL for libui. And the last thing is a native executable packaging. That's the last thing I'd like to add to Glimmer DSL for libui that is missing from Glimmer DSL for SWT.
There are ways to package stuff, right? So is this just a thing that you're just trying to bring it in to libui natively versus hey, you as the developer?
Yes. I just want to automate it.
Okay.
I want to automate it so that you run one command and it's done. Like in Glimmer DSL for SWT, okay, you just run Glimmer space package and it does everything for you, whether you're on Mac, Windows, or Linux.
Yeah,
so
you
can give it some more options too.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I now feel like, I know that people have been able to write desktop apps in Ruby, but as I'm running through these libraries, I'm I feel like we're basically there. It looks really dang good. Sorry guys, I haven't been paying attention to this particular aspect of Ruby for a while, and so
yeah, and there's some more good news regarding Glimmer. Like in relation to the previous question, I got asked about how Glimmer became a sort of a framework, a DSL framework. So part of the mission of Glimmer changed when that happened, and I made it my mission to support every GUI toolkit that's available in Ruby using a Glimmer DSL syntax. So the good news is if somebody wants to only build Linux apps, they don't care about cross-platform, they might be able to do that with libui or SWT. But if, say, they wanted full access to the GNOME Ruby GTK features, I actually built a Glimmer DSL for GTK recently. So that way they can write Glimmer code specifically for GTK apps. I also built one for, I have a Glimmer DSL for TK. I did a Glimmer DSL for Swing, a Glimmer DSL for JavaFX, and a Glimmer DSL for FX Ruby. And these are all the toolkits that are available in Ruby today. I wish WX Ruby would come back, because that's no longer available and supported. If it were, I would have supported it. I know Qt Ruby is gone as well. And also, if it was supported, I would have supported it with a Glimmer DSL. But if they were to ever get supported again, I would be happy to support them with a Glimmer DSL in the future.
Hi, this is Charles Max Wood from Top End Devs, and lately I've been coaching some people on starting some podcasts and in some cases just taking their career to the next level. Whether you're beginner going to intermediate going to advanced, whether you're trying to get noticed in the community or go freelance, I've been helping these folks figure out how to get in front of people, how to build relationships and how to build their careers and max out and just go to the next level. So if you're interested in talking to me and having me help you go to the next level, go to topenddevs.com/coaching. I will give you a 1-hour free session where we can figure out what you're trying to do, where you're trying to go, and figure out what the next steps are. And then from there, we can figure out how to get you to the place you want to go. So once again, that's topenddevs.com/coaching.
So one thing that I always run into, in like basically everything that I do with Ruby, but I feel like is more of a thing that I'm just thinking about like an app that I've always like wanted to actually like create a GUI around, right? And I was like, oh yeah, one of the reasons why I haven't mucked with this is because Ruby, from my experience, has always had issue like with like reading and writing files under certain conditions or whatever. So I'm trying to think like, geez, it has to do with like has something to do with like file handling and like thread handling stuff is like the most common crash that I get with like pop open 3. I don't know. Anyway, I was just kind of curious, like, are there like edge cases around like certain things? And this is the particular like use case that I was thinking like around like file handling, where stuff doesn't perform well. And that might not necessarily be like the fault of Glimmer. Or is there anything that like Glimmer, because you're leveraging some of these underneath libraries, actually handles better than like, my CLI app, right? Because you're going through C or something. And so handling threads better, things like that. Are there some like wins that I'm getting here, I guess?
Yeah, so in Glimmer DSL for SWT, given that it leverages JRuby, it actually has true multi-threading using Java. And in all the apps that I built on Glimmer DSL for SWT, I never had any issues with threading. I simply start a thread whenever I need, and I do some work in it, and then I get back and it's fine. I never even had issues that prompted me to need fibers or any of the newer technology like Raptors. Like I never missed them, to be honest. Like I thought threads were good enough. In CRuby, in Glimmer DSL for TK, when installing TK, you have to recompile Ruby with the TK libraries. And I believe it adds a library called pthread. And I think it adds true threading to Ruby, CRuby. In any case, I haven't had issues with threads in Glimmer DSL for TK either. I know that in Glimmer DSL for libui, I could not use threads the same way as JRuby because they're not concurrent or parallel unless I use Raptors. So without Raptors, I tend to just, whenever I need to have a thread yield to another thread, I tend to make it sleep for a few milliseconds. And that seems to work well enough for me to make the code work concurrently without any problems. So yeah, I have not had any major issues with threads. And as far as your question about files, I've always thought Ruby as being a good file language because it's kind of like Perl and shell scripts. It has very good support for reading files. So I'm not sure I followed what your question was there because I've never had issues with files in Ruby.
I'll find it really quick. It's just a thing that like, I don't know, it's obscure enough, but I've run into it a number of times, but I'll find it for later.
So I'm a little curious, as you work on this, is it mostly written in Java then, or is it mostly written in Ruby?
No, it is mostly written in Ruby. Okay. Actually, it's 100% written in JRuby. I didn't need to do Java for anything.
Oh, I got you. That makes sense. Yeah, because you said it backed onto JRuby. So,
I mean, you could write Java code if you need to and build a component in Java and wrap it in a JRuby component if you really need to, but I've never personally needed to do that.
Right.
I know we've touched on this already, but I want to talk about app stores. So in recent years, the App Store has invaded the Windows and Mac desktops, bringing, in my opinion, an enormous negative step and negative experience deploying desktop applications. You've got a page on packaging and distribution for the SWT Glimmer system through JRuby, but as a desktop developer putting out, leading the charge in Ruby desktops, how has the move to these Windows app stores, Mac app stores, how has that affected your day-to-day?
Yeah, it certainly made it a lot more difficult to install apps. Meaning on the Mac, I'd have to approve the app from the privacy and security, whatever system preferences options. So I'd have to go and approve the app from there after running it the first time before I can start it. And on Windows, it's less difficult. You can approve it right away. You don't have to go to a control panel or something to do it. But yeah, it certainly made it more difficult to start apps after you install them. Like you can install them just fine, but then starting them, you need to pay attention to that. So on the Mac, I know that I'm using something called JPackage for packaging the apps, which is the Java technology. And given that my apps are built in JRuby for Glimmer, DSL for SWT, they could be packaged with JPackage. So JPackage gives you settings or options for passing license keys. And I toyed around with it one time and was able to license an app. And I believe if developers end up getting a proper license from Apple, they can license an app correctly. And then when they distribute it to customers will not need to open and approve the app in privacy settings in their system preferences. So that will resolve that issue. And I know there's also another option for submitting the keys for your Apple Mac subscription, like Mac Apple Store, whatever distribution subscription. Pass those keys, then the packaging app will apply them as well. I did not personally submit any app to the Apple Store. So I couldn't answer your question fully, unfortunately. I need to get experience in that and I have not gotten it yet. So, but the option is on the table. Developers should be able to pass those extra options to the JPackage program that I use in Glimmer DSL for SWT, and they could be passed to the Glimmer command indirectly. And that should resolve those issues for how to distribute an app to customers.
I strongly dislike the direction Apple's going with their desktop. I mean, and especially Microsoft following Apple's lead, in my opinion, is crazy. I mean, the web is absolutely eating the desktop, as we all know. You know, being kind of Ruby and Rails developers, the web is really leaping and is doing things which the desktop just can't in many ways. So to make it more difficult for desktop app developers to deploy is crazy. But I suppose the one upside is the fact that you can monetize through the Windows App Store. You can monetize through the Mac App Store. Have you got any experience on kind of writing desktop apps and charging for them directly through these platforms?
I mean, most of my experience was in Java in the past, most of my professional experience. And it was mostly, back then there were no app stores when I was working on the desktop. And the apps were actually used internally by businesses also. They were not distributed to customers publicly. So I did not work on those sorts of apps that are distributed to customers publicly, like Microsoft Office, for example. So yeah, unfortunately, I couldn't answer your question, but I do have experience with building apps that were distributed internally to customer staff, to salespeople, for example, to help them do demos on their desktop computers to customers using those apps and bring sales as well. Did you have a specific question, though, with that regard? Like regarding building apps that are distributed to customers? Or were you just wondering if it's been done in Ruby?
I just wonder if it's been done in Ruby. I've got a crazy idea for an app, which is essentially a desktop notifications thing. So it sits in the top right of your Mac screen, and then it does something like, I don't know, notifies you about DHH's tweets. It's something amusing. And I would put that on the App Store and charge 99 pence for it, see if anyone bought it, just as a kind of fun experiment. My own personal motivation for these apps is I do quite a lot of hardware integration through Ruby. So I have Raspberry Pis everywhere running various things. And I would quite like to have a non-web mechanism of talking to those things, because they're generally not going through the internet. They're kind of, around my own personal networks. So I'd love a Ruby way to write a desktop app which could send me notifications.
The good news is you can build that app as a tray item app in Glimmer DSL for SWT, which supports tray items, meaning keeping an app in the top right on the Mac in the top right corner as one of those tiny little icons. And so you could do that. And if you ever end up, you could lead the way perhaps of how to pass the proper Apple keys to the Glimmer package command in order to package it for submitting to the App Store. Feel free to contact me online on GitHub or something if you ever do that or end up needing further help with it.
Thank you very much.
No problem.
One thing I'm curious about is, we're talking about Apple and Windows. There are other desktop systems.
No, there aren't. That's it, Chuck. No, they've all closed down. That's it now.
I'm talking to you on a MacBook Pro, so I'm in the ecosystem, but I'm just curious. It sounds like it supports Linux desktops as well.
Yes.
Are there other systems that it supports that that aren't one of those three?
I recently got a request by someone on Glimmer DSL for libui regarding running on the Raspberry Pi. And I got help from someone who's helping me on the libui project, who's working on the back end of Glimmer DSL for libui. And he's working on the libui bindings to the C library. And he basically was able to demonstrate running it on the Raspberry Pi. And he shared a lot of screenshots with us. So I know it's possible to run on things other than just Linux desktop. Also the Raspberry Pi should be able to handle it.
And if you can, the other thing I'm wondering about is going toward mobile, because on Android, they run Kotlin, but Kotlin's a JVM language, just like JRuby is. And then if you can transpile or compile using LLVM to a C or C-based, a C-based language, basically, I believe you can do some gymnastics to get it to run on an iPhone. Have you looked at possibly branching into mobile?
Yes, absolutely. The best possibility right now seems to be Ruby Motion.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to be able to wrap Ruby Motion with a Glimmer DSL. It's just I haven't had a chance to get to it because it requires Xcode and a few extra tools. And at the time when I looked into it a while ago, I had an old machine. Anyways, I got a new machine recently. I should be able to take a look at it. I just haven't had a chance though, because of being torn between many open source projects. But that's certainly an interesting idea, to be able to run Glimmer DSLs on mobile devices, perhaps using Ruby Motion, because it supports both iOS and Android from what I know. So
right, it does.
Having published a Ruby Motion application to the App Store, it's gotten better, but there's still some major issues around it. And that is specifically the API. So I think a Glimmer DSL for Ruby Motion that is cross-compatible with iOS and Android would solve that issue. But currently today, with Ruby Motion, just using Ruby to make your UI for the iOS app does not excuse you from not having to know the Objective-C API library for iOS. And that is the biggest hiccup because the documentation out there is severely lacking. So if you need to make a simple alert, you can't just Google, Ruby iOS alert or anything like that. You're going to have to dig deep into the documentation to see what the Objective-C way of calling an alert is, and then translate that into a Ruby-esque way of calling it. And it's very difficult. So it's almost easier to write Swift or Objective-C in this case to create the iOS application than to use Ruby Motion. I know there had been some efforts, like with a bubble wrap, I think is what it was called, to provide that, but then it wasn't the same for Android. So you still had like one application with two code bases inside of it. And that was like the biggest headache for me. So I think having a proper DSL through Glimmer for iOS and Android, kind of piggybacking off of Ruby Motion, then that's going to really kind of change the Ruby game for iOS or just mobile development in general.
I agree.
If you want me to put you in touch with Amir Rajan, he's the guy that bought and owns and runs Ruby Motion, now Dragon Ruby. I'd be happy to make that introduction for you.
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. I know they use like getting into Ruby Motion and Dragon Ruby a lot easier more recently because I believe now they support a free license of sorts that can get anyone started without having to pay right away. So, I mean, I would look forward to getting to know the people behind Ruby Motion.
Yeah, I seem to remember hearing the same thing, but I can't remember details, and I don't want to confirm it without actually knowing it. So very cool. So what does the testing story look like if you're writing a Glimmer app? How do you test it?
So the good news is that Glimmer supports not just the MVC pattern, but also the MVP model view presenter, or even MVVM model view model patterns. So that means I can split the logic so that by using the bidirectional data binding technology, I could keep the models completely decoupled from the view. So the model code, unlike say with shoes, in shoes apps, I remember seeing a lot of code where the model code is mixed into the view code. Here, you don't have to do that. The logic could be completely well encapsulated in the models, and then you data bind the attributes on the models to the view, and that will propagate the state of the models into the view, so that users can look at say form fields and then interact with them. So that means you can then test the models cleanly without having to worry about the GUI or view components in the tests. So that's part of the story. The other part of the story is if you do want to test the view, Glimmer DSL for SWT was written mostly test first. Initially, it was written test first. Eventually, it became more of a pragmatic approach, but still, it has a very good test coverage. And so all the view components have had unit tests. So you can actually interact with the view components and test their property states in order to do assertions in your tests. No problem with that.
You mentioned the model view presenter system. I have heard of that, but I think a lot of people maybe haven't. Is that something you prefer to an MVC approach?
I tend to use a hybrid of both. I'm depending on the situation. I think Glimmer in general encourages pragmatism and doing what's good enough. So basically, if you need to data bind a lot of view properties, then instead of data binding to the models directly, if you have to do some transformations on the data and the models before they show up on the view, what you could do then is build a presenter in between the model and the view. And then that way you would be using the MVP pattern. And the presenter becomes a sort of an aggregate model that hides the low-level details of models. And then you do data binding between the view properties and the presenter attributes. So that would be MVP. However, if sometimes I built very simple apps that don't even need that much data binding to begin with. So then I can just data bind the views to the models directly and bypass the presenter layer. Not because I wouldn't even need it in that case. And the controllers, MVC, the controllers are implicit in Glimmer. So whenever you add say, for example, on widget selected event on button, meaning the event that gets triggered when you click the button, that event, the handler of the event is the controller, is an implicit controller. So in general, you don't have to do explicit controllers, but if you do, you could do MVP and build the explicit controller as a presenter, basically.
Understood.
So one other thing that I'm wondering about, and I think you kind of alluded to some of it because you mentioned that you could build like a Wordle or something, but I'm wondering, can you build video games with this?
A Glimmer is designed for, first of all, building business desktop applications.
Right.
I think, so I've toyed around with building a lot of, say, board games, kind of like Battlefield, for example, or tic-tac-toe or stuff like that. Real, highly interactive video games is not something that Glimmer is designed for. So maybe you can build them, but I personally have not ventured there that much. I wouldn't say that Glimmer is optimized for gaming. I would say it's more for business apps, and then you can build simple games or board games or word games like Wordle in it. If you want to do something more like gaming intensive, then I would recommend Ruby 2D or Dragon Ruby, perhaps, for that.
Right.
But that doesn't mean it's not something that Glimmer could get into more in the future. But right now, I wouldn't say it's optimized for gaming. I would say it's only simple games and desktop apps.
Right. Well, I know that Java offers some game engine stuff. I think the big dog in the space is Unity, and that's C#.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm assuming you could pull in a Java library and do some of your GUI work. You might have to do it in JRuby or Java instead of
Yeah. So using Glimmer DSL for SWT, you could use any Java library you want. So yes, if there is a gaming engine, I bet you could use it. Also, SWT happens to support OpenGL as an advanced, like a very advanced feature. I did not expose it through Glimmer yet, but it is something that I'm keeping on the radar because I know SWT does support OpenGL. So if needed, I mean, people could actually add that support themselves, given that the project is an open source project. So it shouldn't be an issue. But it's not something that Glimmer currently has ventured into.
Yeah, that leads into the other question that I had, and that was, let's say that I have something I want to contribute, like maybe this, right? What's the process for contributing to Glimmer?
So you can contribute custom widgets very simply. And you simply, so the Glimmer DSL for SWT library has scaffolding support, and you can scaffold apps, but also you can scaffold custom widgets, and you can scaffold custom windows. So what you would do is you would scaffold a custom widget and then implement all the visual concepts that you want in it. And then you simply distribute it on GitHub. However, if you follow a convention in the naming, so if you call it Glimmer -CW for custom widget dash, and then the name of your widget, then people can run a Glimmer command inside their Glimmer project to discover your custom widget. So you can run Glimmer list gems, or I think you could say list gems custom widgets or something like that. Don't quote me on this. It's in the project docs though, but by running a command, you can list all available custom widgets. So right now, there are about 3 or 4 custom widgets that are mostly built by me. But if anybody wants to add more custom widgets, they could do so in their own GitHub project. And then as long as they follow the naming convention, it'll get discovered easily by other developers. I hope I answered your question. Does that address your concern? Were you thinking of things other than custom widgets?
Well, I was thinking also along the lines of maybe beefing up your OpenGL support or adding.
Oh, yeah. Got it. Like oh, yeah. So last year, somebody contributed drag and drop support to Glimmer DSL for TK. Like I had not gotten around to supporting that feature yet. And somebody was like, oh, I need that feature. And I like Glimmer DSL for TK. And I'd like to support that. If you want, I can open a pull request. So I said, sure. And he went ahead and did it. And I tested it and gave him some feedback to fix a few things. And after that, I merged his pull request. And now Glimmer DSL for TK supports drag and drop support that is as good as that of Glimmer DSL for SWT, because I gave that guy advice on how to make it similar to SWT version. So it's as simple as opening a pull request.
Sounds good. What do you prefer the pull request look like? Because I'm assuming that, and I've talked to other open source maintainers, and one of the things that they run into is you get this huge chunk of code that you have to go through. So is there kind of a way that you prefer that those come in?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Like in Glimmer, I follow something I called the Glimmer process. It's a software development process that I came up with from my years of experience in software engineering. That is sort of like a lean, like it's inspired by the Toyota lean processes for building software or for building anything really. So one of the key things in it is basically I like to build features. I'd like to add features option by option and not the whole thing all at once. So if it depends on the size of the feature. If the feature is the work of less than a week, then that could get merged right away. But if it's a feature that is the work of 3 months, I don't like to merge something like that right away. I would say people should divide it into small chunks that are tested, that could be tested independently, and then submit them chunk by chunk. So like, for example, if I wanted to do a breakdown, even drag and drop support, maybe I'll support first drag and drop of labels, like only dragging any label to another label, and that drags the text of it and drops it into the other label. Next, you could support dropping into text fields. Next, you could support dragging maybe the value of a combo box into a text field, etc., etc. So by breaking it down into tiny little features, that way we can make small releases and make sure the project continues to grow in a reliable fashion, instead of having a sort of a big bang kind of growth that ends up with a lot of bugs. So that's definitely, I definitely prefer this approach to pull requests.
I did want to do a little clarification on my question earlier, which you actually inadvertently answered once I actually looked it up. So the issue that I have run into multiple times, I misspoke by saying it was file issue. The issue is like when you are shelling out to something, and then you have to handle both the STD and STD error and your, what did I say, in, out, and error. Okay, so you have to handle all three of those or whatever, and they all happen in different threads. And if your buffer gets too, like if too much stuff happens in one buffer, it'll lock all your buffers. And you can have crashes, you can have lots of things can happen around that. And you typically, the way to solve it typically is to actually like thread when you do that, which is not the easiest to do. But yeah, all the Ruby things for doing it, like provide it to you as if it's just something you can do inline, and then you just discover the problem when you have like large outputs from a shell output or something. That's actually what it was that I keep running into on like literally half of my projects, I swear. So
I tell you what I do,
yeah, that was what it is. But you already said that you handle threading, or that there are ways for threading to be managed. So
I tell you what I do, John. I pipe it all to files and scrape the file. Don't laugh. It's a real thing.
No, it's true. I actually did that on one of my projects, and I didn't hate it, but I was not happy about it still.
The filthy world of software development.
It feels like loading the torpedo tube and then firing, right?
It's feels good, man. Anytime I can touch the file system just like it used to be in the 90s, that's my kind of programming. Can't stand these object database, no SQL. Just give me files. That's all I want. I just want file system, happy little files. I got an awkward question for you, Andy, which I think you're going to hate. And it's about web views. So a lot of the time when I've developed desktop applications, then I start off and you do like native widgets, and you go and get your JSON thing from your website, from your Rails app, and you download your config and you build up a thing, and you have users dragging and dropping their files in from the desktop. And then you get to a complex page like a checkout or something like that, and I just give up. And I just load in a web view and just render whatever it is that I've already got in my Rails app. So what kind of support does Glimmer's various different backends have for that specific scenario where, sure, I want the users to have a native app, but there's a point where I just need to kind of put my Rails page into the desktop?
Yeah, so Glimmer DSL for SWT does support a browser widget. It basically embeds a browser into your app. So, and I've used it quite a number of times. It embeds WebKit by default on the Mac. I've also been able to get it working with Chromium. And on Windows, I believe it supports Edge and IE as well. In any case, I've used it. So one good use for HTML, in my opinion, other than all the horrid uses, like overuse of HTML that we have today in web apps, is basically styled documents, like being able to build documents with, bolded characters, italic characters, colored words, etc. That's a very good use of HTML. So one time I built this math game for kids that was a bowling game. It's not a real bowling game. It's basically you have to answer math questions, and then when you get the result, it shows you a bowling video as if you either had you knocked all the pins or you missed some of the pins, etc. And it was just a fun game to play with my nieces and teach them math. And however, the help page was written as an HTML document. So what I do is when I display the help of the game, I simply open a browser widget and it displays that HTML document. That's the only reason why I use the browser in it. Otherwise, I close the browser once the help is closed, and you just use the app as a standard Ruby GUI app. So if you really have to default to displaying a web view, you can do so with the browser widget. And Glimmer DSL for TK might support something like that as well, using a TK browser widget, which I personally have not looked into. But I know SWT definitely has it, and I've used it quite a number of times. So it's possible to use that if needed. But I mean, you'd have to use it with care, because you don't want to default to having the entire user interface showing up through the browser. Otherwise, you end up with all the problems of web apps of having, you have to maintain JS files and CSS files and HTML files. And it's a lot simpler to just maintain one Ruby code base in a desktop app than to do all of that. That's the whole point of desktop development. So as long as you're mindful of when to use them, the browser widget could be quite useful sometimes.
Thank you very much.
All right. We're kind of getting toward the end of time, but I'm curious if anyone has any other questions before we jump to picks. All right. Let's jump in and do some picks. Hey, folks, if you love this podcast and would like to support the show, or if you wish you could listen without the sponsorship messages, then you're in luck. We're setting up new premium podcast feeds where you can get all of the episodes released after Christmas 2020 without the ads. Signing up will help us pay for editing and production, and you can go sign up at devchat.tv/premium. Dave, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, just have one pick, and it is Sticker Mule. So I recently, backstory, I've used Sticker Mule plenty in the past, but I've never had to order such a high quantity of stickers because I'm doing a career day at my kids' school the next tomorrow. So ordered a bunch of stickers, and they sent me some free Sticker Mule hot sauce. It's really good. If you've never had the Sticker Mule hot sauce, it's really good. It's habanero, so it's somewhat spicy, but then it's also very sweet. So if you like that sweet and / sort of spicy, it's definitely a good sauce to check out.
Very cool. I like Sticker Mule as well. I've used them for a whole bunch of my stickers. John, what are your picks?
All right, so I've got two. So my first one is that our local Aldi has had avocados for like super cheap. They're not all that awesome, but they're cheap. And so we've just been picking them up and making lots of like egg and avocado toast, and it's pretty awesome. In fact, I just ate some for my lunch today. So it's delicious. Obviously, avocados can be crazy expensive, but when they're cheap, they're cheap. So, and it's reasonably healthy for you. So that's pick number one. And pick number two is I've used this gem before, but I had a use case this past week, and it's just really awesome to work with. But Pretender. So if you've ever like had people be like, well, if you've ever basically had a case where you had like admins and users, and you want to view what the user is seeing from your login, Pretender's like super awesome at that. And I know that I run into this fairly often on various apps. And I just had a case where I was creating an admin app where the people that are my clients is adminning other admins. So there's like a whole chain of things. People need to see what other people are seeing and implement a Pretender. It's super easy to implement. It just freaking works. And yeah, and it basically allows you to pretend to be somebody else, and it's great. There are other gems out there that do this as well, but I found Pretender a few years ago, and I've liked it ever since. So that's pick number two.
Awesome. Luke, what are your picks?
I have one pick for you this week, Chuck, and it's a YouTube channel called Pwn Function, spelled PWN Function. Now, quite a few episodes ago, I picked the Polkit vulnerability on Linux as one of my picks. And what this YouTube channel has is 17 minutes of absolute pure gold, where he delves into exactly how this vulnerability works and how to exploit it and the repercussions of it. And it's just a really, really interesting deep dive into how arguments and variables are interacted with from a kind of C level. And I went through the rest of the channel, and it's fantastic. It's one of the best kind of deep technical channels I've found. There's a little animated penguin. If you're interested in that kind of, C level, low level stuff or hacking and that sort of thing, it's a really, really great watch. Can't recommend enough. Pwn Function on YouTube, and I'll stick a link to the Polkit bug.
All right. I'm going to jump in with a few picks here. First of all, I'm going to pick a board game because that's what I do every time. The board game I'm going to pick this time is Pandemic Iberia. Now, there are a whole bunch of Pandemic games. This one's pretty close to the original Pandemic rules. There are a few variations on it. So this takes place in Iberia, which, if you're not familiar, it's basically Spain and Portugal. And you move around and cure diseases, right? Things like that, just like you do in Pandemic. The difference is that you can also place water purifying tokens, because this takes place in the 1930s is where it's set. So when you purify water, it keeps disease from spreading, is the idea. You can also build trains And then you can move along the train line more quickly than you can move across the board. And then the other analog is in Pandemic, you can fly between cities. And in Pandemic Iberia, if you're not using the train, you can sail from coastal cities. And when you cure the disease, the cards, instead of being able to like treat all the diseases in a city, what you wind up doing is you wind up being able to place those purifying tokens with the cards of the color of the disease you cured. Because technically you didn't cure it, you researched it because it's the 1930s. So beyond that, I mean, that's kind of the major gist of it if you're familiar with Pandemic. It's been pretty fun. My wife and her friends have been playing through all of the versions of Pandemic. And so this is the last, I think this is the last one. And it's got 2 other variations in it, right? So you can play where the diseases are a little bit harder to deal with. So they have all got like special rules. And then the other version was, I'm trying to remember what the deal was with the other version. I can't think of it at the moment. But anyway, let me pull up Board Game Geek and I'll tell you how complicated it is.
You've been playing through it. I've been living through it.
Yeah, kind of. Let's see. So Board Game Geek says that it has a weight of 2.58. So it's not a terribly complicated game, but it's a somewhat complicated game. But it's a fun one. So I'm going to pick that. And then lately, another thing that I've been doing is I've been working on the automation for the podcasts. And I've pretty much got everything wrangled for JavaScript Jabber. And so I'm going to start moving it to the other shows. The tools that I'm using, I'm just going to pick them because they're pretty handy. One of them is Podio. I think I've mentioned it before because I'm also using Podio as my CRM. And you can just pull in their different apps, is what they call them. And then you can tie them together and you can build automations in it for free. The other thing that I like about it, we were trying to use Monday.com before, but the problem with Monday.com is in order for me to add all these other guys that are on the show, I would actually have to pay for a license for each of them. And that adds up pretty quickly when you have 9 or 10 shows that all have 3 to 5 people on each of them. It wasn't financially feasible for me to do. And Podio allows you to add app-specific users to, or workspace-specific users to Workspace called light users, and you don't have to pay for a license for them. So anyway, really digging it. Working on getting, JavaScript Jabber folks to start using it. And then we'll start moving things over. The other piece, though, is we're using Schedule Once for our scheduling. And so you have to connect them together. I'm using make.com for that. I've been using Zapier for a long time, but make.com has a handful of features that Zapier doesn't that are really, really nice. One of them is that you can actually fork your process. So meaning that you can put in a router. And so if the user exists or if the guest exists in this case, right, then go ahead and add them to the episode in Podio, or if they don't exist, then create them, then add them, right, and then do the rest of the work. So that's pretty nice. The only downside that I've had to make is that in that feature in particular, there's no straightforward reversal to that, right? So what I mean is what I'd like to do is I'd like to have it fork on whether or not I have a user or a guest, right, and create the guest or find the guest and then merge back together and do the rest of the process. And it doesn't have a clean way to do that. So I've wound up duplicating some stuff or creating another process and telling it to call it, which isn't straightforward to make either. But overall, it seems to have a much easier method of managing stuff. So I'm moving off of Zapier and onto Make. And then I'm using GlobeMail, which is an email system it's specifically designed for Podio. And it allows you to set up emails and it'll send the emails. And when people reply to the email, it'll add it back to the item in your app. And so that's pretty handy as well. Anyway, I'm really, really digging all this stuff. And I think it's going to take a bunch of load off of my team that kind of manages all this stuff. The other piece of this is that I added a widget where Michaela, who's my VA, can add in suggested topics, or anybody else who has access to the workspace can add suggested topics. And then when it's approved, they just click on the approval and it will automatically send out the email to get it scheduled. It'll track the progress on the invitation, and it allows the hosts the other hosts to approve invitations. Before, she's been putting them in a board on Monday, but since I'm the only person who can access it, I just kind of go, yeah, this is okay. And, we're going to skip that one because it's too simple or because it's not really relevant or whatever, right? And so now these guys can get in and do it, or they can add their own suggestions and then just hit the approval themselves, because I pretty much open it up to our hosts to invite people that they think would make good guests. So they could put it in and approve it themselves, and then it would send out that invitation. And if they reply to it, they just reply to Michaela and she can jump on and help them get all set up. So anyway, lots of cool stuff there. The piece that I'm trying to pull in now is Write Signature, which is kind of like, what is it? It's the e-signature systems that DocuSign. It's kind of like DocuSign, except it also integrates cleanly, or it's supposed to, with Podio. I've been having a little bit of trouble with that particular integration, but from there, then I'm planning to start. I've talked to an attorney, and legally, if a guest comes on the show with the expectation of being recorded and released, then Top End Devs owns the rights to the recording, and we can do whatever we want with it. But I feel like it's better to give people kind of an explicit, hey, look, this is what we're going to do. This is what the expectations are. And by the way, we own the recording. And that way there's no confusion. I've had one or two people that got confused about that, and I've had to work with them to try and make sure that everybody's happy with the way things are going, because I do want our guests to be happy with it. But this way, it just clarifies exactly what we can and can't do, and then if anyone has a concern, they can raise it. But that'll just be added to the process of coming on as a guest, as you would just e-sign a document that says, I understand that this is what's going to happen, right? We're going to record it, we're going to edit it, we're going to release it, and all that good stuff. So anyway, that's kind of the deal there. I have a friend that's using it for his summits as well. That's kind of what got me into it, and I'm looking forward to using it for that. So as we get into Top End Dev Summit or the Rails Summit, where we have DHH coming to answer questions in August, as I get speakers and all that stuff, I'm planning on pulling all that together there too. So anyway, I'm going to pick all those things. And then, if you go to topenddevs.com/conferences, since I mentioned that, I'm hoping to have the conference list up with dates here within the next week. So as you listen to this, it should be up. You should be able to go and see when the conferences are and which speakers I've been able to line up already. So anyway, those are my picks. Andy, what are your picks?
I figured, I've given enough picks with Glimmer, so I don't have any, really.
Okay. If people want to connect with you online, where do they find you?
GitHub. There's also a Glimmer Gitter chat room as well.
Okay.
My GitHub handle is Andy Optiva. Optiva is spelled Obtiva. So ANDYOBTIVA.
Awesome. And if you want to put links to your GitHub and to the Gitter channel in the chat, we'll make sure they end up in the show notes so people can jump on. All right. Well, we're going to wrap it up here. Thank you all for coming. And until next time, max out.
Talk to you later.
Thank you.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.